Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Joseph, the Vice President of Market Development here at ShareVault, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar about NIH small business programs and what biomedical entrepreneurs should know. It's clear from the number of registrants that this topic is of great interest, and we very much appreciate you joining us today. Before we get to the presentation, I'd like to mention and acknowledge the two sponsors of this event, and I'll also briefly cover some logistical items. And then after I introduce the speakers, they will spend about 40 minutes presenting, and in the remaining time after that, they'll respond to your questions. So start thinking about questions already now. Today's webinar is sponsored by Women in Bio and by ShareVault. If you're not familiar with Women in Bio, it's an organization of professionals that's committed to promoting careers, leadership, and entrepreneurship for women in the life sciences. Its members work at biotech and pharma companies, universities and institutes, law and accounting firms, marketing and PR firms, CROs and CMOs, and many of the members are entrepreneurs. So a focus on entrepreneurship has remained core to the mission of Women in Bio since its founding in 2002. Women in Bio, and specifically its Executive Director, Jamie Strakota, together with our speakers, proposed today's topic. And so I'd like to thank Jamie and the organization for their efforts and support in bringing this webinar to you. For those of you who don't know ShareVault, we provide cloud-based secure document sharing systems and virtual data rooms that organizations of all types and sizes use for sharing highly confidential documents with external parties. Specifically within the life sciences arena, companies, universities, and other organizations use ShareVault to control and track their documents, especially during fundraising, licensing, and partnering activities. And because of our product leadership, our customer base in 48 countries, and our contribution to the life sciences industry in the form of sponsorship of events like this one, ShareVault's service has been chosen by Bio and more than 36 other trade associations for their member benefits program. I'd like to encourage you, our audience, to go to the websites of both these organizations to learn more about them. So now let's briefly cover some logistics. During the presentation, if you have questions that you would like the speakers to address, you can submit them at any time through the questions box in your GoToMeeting control panel. We'll certainly try to get to as many of them as possible, but if we can't get to all of the questions before we run out of time, the questions will be forwarded to our speakers so that they can respond individually. Also, in case you can't stay for the whole presentation, or you would like to go through it again, and you'll see it's very deep content, it is being recorded, and you'll be notified by email when it's available, how to get access to it, and also how to get copies of the slides. That's a very common question. There will be copies of the slides made available to you. Okay, it's now time to introduce our two speakers. The first presenter today is Kory Hallett. Kory joined the Sbir Development Center at the National Cancer Institute in 2014 as a fellow in the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program. Kory manages program evaluation for the Development Center, provides program support for immune oncology and immunotherapy projects, and is involved in several of the initiatives offered by the NIH and NCI Sbir Sttr program for small businesses. One example is coordinating a recently formed working group at NIH that is focused on women-owned and socially and economically disadvantaged businesses. Prior to joining the NCI Sbir Development Center, Kory was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, with a focus on immunotherapy for neuroblastoma and melanoma. Following Kory, our other guest presenter is Stephanie Fertig, the Director of Small Business Programs in the Office of Translational Research at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. Stephanie manages several programs at the Institute, but her main focus is the Small Business Innovation Research, SBIR, and Small Business Technology Transfer, Sttr program, which we're going to learn about in a moment. Prior to her position in the Office of Translational Research, she worked in the Institute's Division of Extramural Research and focused on traumatic brain injury and neural engineering. Stephanie has both a science and business background with an MBA from the University of Maryland's Robert H. Smith School of Business. Okay, we're now ready for Kory and Stephanie's presentations, with Kory going first. Kory, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. And we want to thank the Women in Bio and thank ShareVault for this opportunity today. So as was mentioned in our introduction, I'm Kory Hallett. I'll be speaking, followed by my colleague Stephanie Fertig. I'm in the National Cancer Institute, and Stephanie is in NINDS. But in addition to our roles in our institutes, we also sit on a working group for women-owned and socially and economically disadvantaged businesses. Up on your screen right now are our colleagues on that working group. And so you can see it has representation from multiple NIH institutes as well as the CDC. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you an overview of the SBIR and Sttr programs at NIH, and talk about program eligibility, and then give you some program-specific information. Stephanie will discuss the solicitations and funding opportunities, talk about the NIH peer review process, and then some programs to help transition to the marketplace. Next slide, please. So the SBIR and Sttr programs are programs that are offered by all federal agencies that have an extramural budget. As you can see from this slide, the Department of Defense has the largest SBIR program with approximately $1 billion in funding. HHS, which is our department, funds just under $800 million a year in SBIR and Sttr programs. Next slide, please. So the SBIR and Sttr programs are congressionally mandated. When we discuss these programs, we speak of them as SBIR, that's our shorthand, but it actually refers to two sister programs. The first is the SBIR, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which is a set-aside program for small businesses to engage in R&D. The second program, sister program, is Sttr. It's the Small Business Technology Transfer Program. This program is really a set-aside to facilitate cooperative R&D between businesses and not-for-profit research institutions, which are generally academic institutions, but not always. Our set-aside is a percentage of the extramural budget. It is about 3% for FY16 for the SBIR and 0.45% for Sttr. It's important to note that although the Sttr set-aside is significantly smaller as a percentage than the SBIR, that the success rates for each program is similar. Next slide, please. So at HHS, NIH administers the majority of the grants for the HHS program, and our agency offers the most funding with $691 million with our 2015 budget for SBIR, and $95 million was our 2015 budget for Sttr. CDC has a $7 million budget, and FDA also is administered through NIH, and it has just under about 1.5 million, just under 1.5 million. At HHS, NIH is the only agency that offers an Sttr program. Next slide, please. So the goal of the SBIR and Sttr programs is to support small businesses. But at NIH, we do that within our NIH mission, which is to seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. So in our SBIR and Sttr programs, we fund small businesses whose technology is applies to this mission. Next slide, please. The National Institutes of Health is made up by 27 different institutes and centers. 23 of them have SBIR, administer SBIR and Sttr programs. 4 of them lack funding authority and therefore do not offer SBIR, Sttr funding. Each of the institutes administers their SBIR and Sttr program in a little bit different way. So it's important, if you are going to apply for SBIR funding at NIH, to contact the IC, as our shorthand for institute or center, so the IC that works in your disease area, and talk to them about their specific program. Next slide, please. So the SBIR program is a 3-phase program. The phase 1, or discovery phase, is feasibility. The standard award for a phase 1 is $150,000 for SBIR or Sttr, and there's some, that is a standard award, but there are some changes that can be made. And the project period is between 6 months and 1 year. Phase 2, or the development phase, is for full research or research and development efforts. The standard award for phase 2 is $1 million over 2 years. We also offer a phase 2B. This is offered by most ICs, but not all ICs participate, and how they participate varies. Generally, this is used for clinical R&D activities or R&D activities that enable a regulatory filing, and there's an opportunity for up to $1 million per year for up to 3 years. We say that phase 3 is intended is a 3-phase program. However, supported. Next slide, please. So a phase 1 application, you apply for a phase 1 application and then move on, complete those activities and move on and apply for a phase 2, go through review and receive the phase 2. That is a standard path through the program. Next slide. An alternative, previous slide, sorry. An alternative is to apply for a fast-track application. There. In a fast-track application, there's a phase 1 component and a phase 2 component, and both of those components are reviewed simultaneously. The fast-track, the name fast-track, you don't get the money earlier, but what happens is at the end of your phase 1 component of your award, you don't have to apply and wait for a whole nother peer-reviewed process because you were reviewed at the initial step. So the program officer will check to make sure that your milestones have been met, and you'll move on directly to a phase 2 at that point. Next slide, please. We also now offer a direct to phase 2. Direct to phase 2 is only offered for SBIR eligible projects. Sttr eligible projects are not eligible for direct to phase 2. In this, to apply direct to phase 2, you have to have completed your phase 1 type research, and you apply just directly for a phase 2, just as it sounds. Not all institutes and centers are participating, and so it's important to check the funding announcement and make sure that the institute or center for which your technology applies is participating in this program. Next slide. The NIH office, SBIR office, recently redid their website, and so this is put up just to show you what their new website looks like. I want to call your attention to the button on the left-hand side that says New to SBIR and Sttr, Where to Start. This info, it takes you to an infographic, which I think is shown in the next slide. It takes you to an infographic that shows the steps of the SBIR and Sttr application process. It'll show you the requirements at each stage. There are several registrations that need to take place in order to be eligible for applying to NIH. And so those registrations will be shown on this infographic. And even if you're not in the SBIR Sttr program, this is a really useful.
Kory, I think this is Steve. We've lost your sound there for a minute. If you could check that, and Stephanie, maybe you could cover some of this as well.
Sorry, can you hear me again?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Sorry. So this infographic is a really great resource for people who are new to SBIR, or people who are not new to SBIR should also go look at this infographic. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through some program eligibility and then move on to some program specifics. Next slide. So to be eligible for SBIR and Sttr funding, that you have to have an organized for-profit business that is U.S. owned and operated. It has to be a small business by SBA, or Small Business Administration definition, which is 500 or fewer employees, including affiliates. So as I said, it must be U.S. owned and U.S. operated. The ownership has to be greater than 50% owned by U.S. individuals, or greater than 50% owned by U.S. companies. There is a newer provision that allows firms to be owned by venture capital operating companies, hedge funds, private equity firms. The caveat to this is that it must be owned by more than one. There can't be majority ownership by a single venture capital, for example. There must be multiple. And the eligibility criteria, it's important to note, are determined at time of award. Next slide, please. There's a few critical differences between the SBIR and the Sttr program. One is partnering. While in SBIR, partnering is permitted, in Sttr, because it is a cooperative agreement, partnering is required with a not-for-profit research institution. SBIR, while partnering is permitted, there is limited partnering that can be done. So in phase 1, 33% of the work may be outsourced, and in phase 2, 50%. However, in Sttr, 30% of the work must be outsourced to the research institution partner. 40% must be completed by the small business, and the remaining 30% can be completed by either of those two entities. Another factor that people generally use to decide whether they will apply for SBIR or Sttr funding is the Principal Investigator. With SBIR, the Principal Investigator's main primary place of employment must be with the small business, whereas with Sttr, the PI may be employed by either institution and their employment is not stipulated. In either of these programs, it's important to know that the award is always made to the small business. Next slide, please. So important factors to remember is the eligibility is determined at time of award. The PI must have the correct experience and expertise to oversee the project, but they are not required to have a PhD or MD. You may submit applications to different agencies that are similar. However, they cannot be overlapping, or excuse me, they cannot be duplicative. Next slide, please. So a few more program specifics, and then I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie. Next slide. These are our success rates, our NIH-wide success rates for FY.
I think we lost your sound again there for...
And so the table's there.
Can you just repeat that a minute, Kory? I think your sound dropped out there.
Sure, I'm sorry. The table I'm not going to discuss today. I am only going to discuss the graph. The table is there for reference at a later time. So for fast-track applications in FY14, there was variability in the success rate between SBIR and Sttr. However, for a traditional phase 1 and for a phase 2 application, the success rates in SBIR and in Sttr were similar. And for a phase 1, that generally is around 20%, and phase 2, it's generally around 40%, and that is historically fairly accurate. Next slide, please. However, 20% funding rate means that 80% of the applications are not being funded, and so it's important to be prepared to resubmit. We have many very successful companies that needed to resubmit their application. It was not funded on the first time. Mary Podesek, who is president and co-founder of Sympatech, who is an NCI awardee, discussed this earlier this year, pointing out that oftentimes when the review comes back, the reviewers are critiquing the science and not concerned about feelings. And so sometimes receiving those reviews can make you not want to resubmit, but hunker down, correct what the reviewers think you should be corrected, and don't give up. Just keep moving forward. Next slide, please. I mentioned the standard award amounts previously. For an SBIR, a standard award for phase 1 is $150,000 for SBIR and Sttr, and a phase 2 is $1 million. We have authority from Congress to increase those amounts by 50%, raising the phase 1 cap to $225,000 and the phase 2 cap to $1.5 million. Next slide, please. However, because NIH funds many technologies that have very expensive development paths, the agency has applied for waivers from the Small Business Administration for certain topic areas. The topic areas are listed at the end of the omnibus funding solicitation, and each institute and center has their own primary areas of interest. And in these, if your technology applies to one of these areas of interest, you can exceed the hard cap for both phase 1 and phase 2. And the amount which you can exceed is IC specific. So you should contact your IC and look and find out their waiver topic cap. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie to talk about solicitations and funding opportunities.
Great. Thanks, Kory. So hopefully everyone can hear me. So all of our solicitations and funding opportunities can be found on that webpage. It's a great resource, that SBIR Sttr webpage. We call them FOAs or funding opportunities, and you can find those at the website below. And let's go to the next slide. So the parent funding opportunity, or omnibus, that Kory was referring to earlier, is where the vast majority of applications come in. So a lot of people get very concerned that we don't have a targeted, specific funding opportunity for them. And I tell people, don't worry. Come in through the omnibus solicitation. Come in through that parent opportunity. We are investigator initiated. We're a little bit different from some of the other agencies, and that is one of our main focus. And so please come in. If it's within the NIH mission, you can come in through that general parent opportunity. And it's got standard receipt dates. The next one coming up is April 5th. Now we also have a contract solicitation. It's SBIR only, and the important thing to note for the contract solicitation is that not all institutes participate. So for example, I know NCI, lots of contracts, NINDS, no contracts. So, depending upon what you're planning to propose, you may or may not have something in that contract solicitation, and that generally goes out sometime in July and August. And all of this information is released in the NIH Guide for Grants and Contracts, and again, you can get all this on the website. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the difference between the general solicitation and targeted solicitation? Well, the general solicitation, they have standard receipt dates. Targeted solicitation can have either standard receipt dates or customized due dates. The Sbir and Sttr are generally reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Targeted program announcements may or may not be at the Center for Scientific Review. They may also be reviewed within the inside the institute. The application instructions, while they're similar, the targeted program announcements may have specific additional instructions that you need to follow in the program announcement. And that could include special review questions that we're going to have the reviewers ask. So how your application may be judged may be different. So you should really read those program announcements very carefully. And again, while all of us participate in the Journal Omnibus solicitation, not all institutes participate in every program announcement. Now, not every targeted announcement is the same. And one thing another misconception is that if there's a targeted program announcement, there must be a special set aside. That's not true. Not all targeted program announcements have a set aside. Not all targeted program announcements have specific review criteria or go to a special review. So if you have a question about a specific targeted program announcement, if it gives you a special review or has a special set aside and you're not sure, you can always contact the program person that's listed at the bottom of that program announcement, and they'll be able to tell you. Next slide. Okay, can't emphasize enough the importance of starting the electronic submission process early. There are a number of registrations that are required that trips up at least 1 or 2 or 3 people for me that contact me every round. Make sure all of these registrations are completed well in advance of the receipt date, and they're all up to date. For example, I know that the system for awards management, you need to make sure that that's active for the company. And remember, you're applying through the company, has to be active for the company. And that infographic is really important. Next slide. Okay, there's a number of ways that you can submit. We have the standard downloadable forms. That's the way we've just traditionally been doing it. But now we have the new online assist program. It's optional, but I've heard a lot of positive things. It makes the form management a lot easier. Applying for an application, applying through to the Sbir and Sttr program is not trivial, and my understanding is the assist program makes it easier. Next slide. So one of the questions, and this is particularly important for, I think, this group, one of the questions that is on the application is, are you a women-owned small business? And we found that people are concerned about whether or not they should check the box and what is the definition. So the definition is that you have to be 51% owned and controlled by 1 or more women and primarily managed by 1 or more women. Now, you're self-certifying on that form with us. We don't come after people. We're looking at your self-certification. We ask that people be truthful. If you have questions about whether or not you should check that box, program staff can certainly talk with you about that. But we really are encouraging people to make sure, if you are a women-owned business, please check that box. It helps us with our reporting. In addition, if there's any kind of special workshops or webinars that we might do that may be targeted towards women-owned businesses, that's how we outreach. That's our outreach list. So I would encourage you to please report and report honestly whenever you apply. Next slide. Same goes for socially and economically disadvantaged businesses. Now, these slides are going to be available, so for all those who have that burning question, we are going to make these slides available if you joined a little bit late. And there is some specific guidance on the Small Business Administration's website, and you, again, self-certify for this. And once again, if you have questions or specific, you're not sure if you should certify, we might be able to answer and help guide you on making the right choice. But again, you self-certify, and we're really encouraging people to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about the peer review process. So This is the peer review process. So as you can see, unlike what you may have thought, this isn't a black box. It's not like you throw the application in and a score may or may not come out. There is actually a nice process here. And one of the things that I've done is I put in red each of the points of contact, each of the individuals that you should be contacting along this in this process. So first, when you have an idea and when you're thinking about, okay, am I eligible? What should I do? You can contact program staff. And program staff is individuals like Kory and myself at the different institutes and centers who can help talk with you about where does your project fit? Is a small business grant the best option, or are there other options and other programs? So then we can help guide you. Now, contact us early. That's really important because, as you can imagine, we get a number of calls, particularly as we get closer to those receipt dates. Now, once you're submitting your application, going through the electronic process, we are no longer helpful. So that's when the ERA comments and the grants.gov help desk become really important. And then that previous slide when we were talking about assist, it goes to grants.gov, and then it goes to the NIH system ERA comments. And it has to go through both of those systems in order for us to receive it, and that's why both of those help desks are sometimes important. Now, the Center for Scientific Review is the one that receives that application for NIH because you're submitting to NIH, not a specific institute and center. And then it goes to the referral office there. They assign it to an institute, and they assign it to a specific IRD, or specific study section. Now, during the review process, the scientific review officer is the point of contact there. They manage the review, they run the review. Once you receive your summary statement, you can then reach out to the program officers, and I really do encourage you to do that, even if your summary statement's not great. As we said before, a lot of people do have to resubmit. Contact the program staff. We've seen a million summary statements. I go to the reviews. I can help you interpret that summary statement and think about, how do you want to respond to those critiques? And then we work with both program staff, and then we also work with our grants management team in order to award applications. One of the things, to award the grants, one of the things that people do that they shouldn't do is ignore emails from grants management. They write the checks. Make sure you don't ignore emails from our grants management staff. Next slide, please. Okay, so how long does this whole process take? From the time of application to the time of review, it's about 1 to 2 months. From review to the advisory council, which is the second level of review, it's about 3 months. And then from there, it's about 2 to 4 months to allocate funds. But keep in mind that that last leg in particular, that may differ depending upon what our current budget situation is. Next slide. Okay, here is the review criteria. In the interest of time, I am not going to go through each of these review criteria specifically. That information is on CSR, the Center for Scientific Review's webpage. It's also in every funding opportunity. The specific questions that reviewers are supposed to be asking themselves about your application. It's a guide to help you determine what they're going to be thinking about. But this gives you an idea of the different criteria that we use when thinking about an application. Next slide. So when is SBIR appropriate? Well, really, it's for those times when it's too early for private investment. You need either additional feasibility data or further development. And we've included some quotes here from women-owned companies who really used the SBIR program. So we have investors want to see that a technology works. SBIR funding has been critical to our company to show that our technology works. And then next slide. And then, my laboratory was working in drug development, and it takes a long time to license the technology. It was hard to push forward with only R01 funding, and we had a neat technology that was worth pursuing. And so I think the SBIR program can help you transition from a interesting and cool technology to something that is maybe a little bit more commercially viable. Next slide. Okay, so if you take nothing from this entire presentation, please talk to your program officer. We can help you. It's our job. give us at least 1 month before the deadline. Our crunch timer on the deadline gets really dicey, particularly for that January 5th receipt date. So make sure you contact us in advance, but please talk to us. We're here to help. And submit early. Don't wait till the last minute. Often if people have an error or have a problem with their submission, if you wait till the last minute, you can't correct that error. So please submit early. And if you have questions on who to contact, there is specific contact information on that sbir.nih.gov webpage, or you can email our Office of the Director at the email here. They do staff that, and they will try to connect you to the right and most appropriate person. Next slide. So here are some common application problems. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I think if you later, I would encourage everyone to kind of look at these and think very carefully about when you're thinking about your application. Make sure that your application doesn't, have one of these critical errors. And the other thing I would encourage you to do is when you're writing an application, if you start eating, sleeping, and breathing the application, you can't sometimes see the assumptions that you're making. Give it to other individuals. I always joke, give it to the most critical person that you know. Have them read your application. Make sure they're somebody who hasn't been eating, sleeping, and breathing your application. Have them read it. Do they understand it? Are there things that they see are critical gaps? Do they really like it? Are they jazzed by it? That, give it to another person. Don't be afraid to have people read your application. Next slide, please. So I want to take, kind of conclude with talking about some of the programs that we have once you're part of the SBIR program that you can take advantage of. And I'm mentioning these because I think people don't take advantage of them, and it always amazes me. You have now access to this program, and you have these free opportunities. So next slide. So we talked briefly about the Phase 2B, which is, again, since as Kory said, commercialization, we really don't, generally people aren't making products for us to purchase, unlike the Department of Defense or other agencies. And so we recognize that we need to fill the gap between the Phase 2 and, say, commercialization. A lot of our products take a long time. And so we've created the Phase 2B, which is a competing renewal. It allows you to get some additional funds to help you get to the point of commercialization, but not everybody participates. If you've got a Phase 2 SBIR or Sttr, you're thinking about doing a Phase 2B, talk to your program officer. That's critical because each institute runs their program a little bit differently. Next slide. We also have a new commercialization readiness pilot where if you're either a Phase 2 or even a Phase 2B, you can, in some instances, you can actually use this commercialization readiness pilot to get either technical assistance or technical assistance in late-stage development to allow you to move to the commercialization phase. This is a brand new program. It's a pilot program. We're kind of testing it out. We've got specific webinar materials that are available, again, at that sbir.nih.gov website. And if you're interested in this, you have a Phase 2 from one of these institutes listed here, contact your program officer to discuss this option. It's a great new program. Next slide. Okay, we have a number of technical assistance programs that are open to all eligible SBIR, Sttr awardees. The first is for Phase 1 awardees, and that's the NAP that you see, that first one. And that's really to do market analysis. It helps you get some of the information, the materials you need to write a Phase 2. I can tell you for NINDS companies, there's a significant benefit to being part of the NAP. So, and we've seen it from a statistic, looking at our how do people get, how well do people do in getting their Phase 2s, and people who participate in the NAP have a higher probability of getting their Phase 2. The second one is the CAP. That's the Phase 2 awardees, and that really helps you do, again, technical assistance and training in a variety of different areas. We've listed them here. Next slide. For Phase 1 awardees, we also have the new I-Core program at NIH. It's an intensive entrepreneurial immersion course for scientists. I would encourage you, if you're a Phase 1 awardee, consider doing I-Core. Even if you think, oh, I know all of that stuff. we've found that people who thought that go through the program and still learn a great deal, and it really helps them push on their technology and really investigate the market and the commercialization, their thoughts around the commercialization of that technology. So I would strongly encourage you to look at that. And again, a number of the NIH institutes are doing different facilitating partnerships in a variety of ways, including participating in conferences and sending our awardees to different conferences. I send out emails all the time, hey, there's this new conference opportunity. Please get back to me if you're interested. It always amazes me how few people get back. So please make sure that you're aware of everything that the institute that you're part of is doing. Next slide. And there are a number of institute-specific programs. We listed some here for the National Cancer Institute. They've got investor forums that they're really working on to try to move things and commercialize. The NHLBI, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, is also doing innovation conferences as well, in addition to those investor conferences that many other ICs participate in. Next slide. And finally, there's through the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, but it's not specific to their institute, they have some small biz hangouts, and they're really help educate the community on specific topic areas, including regulatory and commercialization, intellectual property. So these are a great resource. They're open to the public, and I would encourage you to check those out. And so I think this is our last slide. It tells you all the places that you can get information. There's a number of ways to get connected with us, including the web, beyond the website. And I would encourage you to reach out to us. As I said, if you take nothing from this conversation, reach out to your program officer. We really can help you through the process and answer any questions that you might have, particularly since each institute does really run their program a little bit differently. So with that, I think we're going to try to leave the rest of the time for some audience question and answer.
Stephanie and Kory, thank you. You've just provided our audience with a ton of valuable SBIR, Sttr information about applying for the program, about the process for learning about the program, and just going through that whole process. Speaking for everyone involved, we very much appreciate the time and effort that you've both put into organizing and presenting the information. We're now moving to the Q&A part of the webinar, so our two speakers can respond to the audience questions that we've already received. But it's not too late if anyone still has questions they would like to ask. Just enter your question in the GoToMeeting control panel question box. As I mentioned, we'll try to cover as many as possible during the remaining time, but if we don't get to all of them, we'll forward the unanswered questions to Stephanie and Kory for them to respond directly. So when we look at bring up the first question here. And there's a lot of questions, so just give me a moment to go through this list.
Well, that's good.
For the question phase of the presentation, we are a small business and are working with the college, the University of Pittsburgh. I won't mention the name of the business, but just wanted to generalize the question. We're working with a college on technology owned by the university and wish to apply for SBIR funding. What licensing arrangements should we make in order to enable us, the small business, to go after SBIR funding? For example, should we ask for our company to have licensing right of first refusal for joint licensing or for any other specific licensing arrangement?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things that I will tell you, pretty much across the board is that NIH tries not to get involved with the specific negotiations between the company and the university. I think what you need to think about, and the one thing I would encourage people to think about as they're putting together this licensing is the licensing issue does come up in review. So for example, if you don't have access to the technology at all, or you don't have any license in place, people might, the reviewers who are your peers, because it is peer reviewed, the reviewers might ask, well, wait a minute, what's to stop other people from licensing this? So you should have, a license that is amenable to both you and the university. and that would sound reasonable to your peers as a way to be able to move your company forward. But we won't specifically tell you you need this kind of license or that kind of license to move forward.
Another question is a company that outsources all R&D eligible for NIH or government grant applications in general?
So grant applications in general is a little bit different because each grant program has their own specific policies associated with it. So I'm not going to go down that road, although there isn't specific work requirements for things, say, like an R01 or a U01 cooperative agreement. And an R01 is a standard research grant. But for an SBIR or an Sttr, a specific amount of work must be done by the company. So that means that the company can't be virtual or can't outsource everything. Now that said, so a lot of companies hear that and they say, well, then SBIRs aren't for me. That's not necessarily the case. And I think if you've got a situation where you've generally outsourced a lot, keep in mind all that eligibility is at the time of award. So you can submit an application and say, hey, if we get this application, if we get this application funded, we're going to hire this person. We're going to get this space. And so there are some different options, and I would encourage you to, again, contact your program official or contact the program official for the institute that you're applying to, and we can talk to you about the different ways that people have managed the question of how much work needs to be done by the company.
Okay.
Can I add one thing to that real quick? So yes, absolutely contact your program office. Contact them early during the application process if you need to know how to show that you can that everything will be together at time of award. But then at time of award, contact your program officer and talk to them again about the structure of your company and why you're not virtual, because there might need to be conversations between your program officer and grants management. So in those cases, it's really very important that you have frequent contact with the program office.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Next question. When can you apply to Phase 2 if you get Phase 1? Do you have to wait until completion, or can you start applying midway towards the end? And what is the success rate for a fast track?
Those are all great questions. So first, you can apply before your Phase 1 is ended. My only warning there is that you have to show enough progress on that Phase 1 so that review can feel as though you should move on to the Phase 2. So they do look at the progress in the Phase 1 when determining, the score. So just something to keep in mind. Now, we did have on one of the slides, did actually have the specific success rates for the fast track. And my warning on those fast track success rates is generally we have far fewer fast tracks than we do standard Phase 1s and Phase 2s. Usually, and one of the things you'll see is that we have a very, very few Sttr fast tracks, for example, so the success rate there tends to fluctuate wildly. Usually, the fast track success rate hovers somewhere around the Phase 1 success rate, which is somewhere, we have specific percentages there, but it usually hovers somewhere between 50 to 20. So, for the entire NIH. Now, depending upon the institute, that actually may vary. Some institutes are more competitive than others. And actually, this kind of leads me to the whole question of budget that Kory alluded to, which was, if you look at the Sttr, gosh, it has such a smaller, there's percentage set aside there is so much smaller, so obviously it's better to be an SBIR. Not necessarily true. They're usually about comparable across NIH, but it depends on the institute. Similarly, NCI is the largest institute, but that doesn't mean they have the best success rates. That's actually not true. It's a very competitive program versus other institutes that may be smaller and might actually have success rates that are a little higher. So don't look at the total overall budget of the organization to determine whether or not you should apply. That's actually not a good way to try to target your application.
Here's a question that I think is interesting because I'll label it as fairly provocative, so I'm eager to hear the answers from both of you. We hear from the NIH people that most of the reviewers have no business background. We certainly can see this reflected on the SBIR Phase 2 selection results. Is there anything that NIH is doing to fix this? If startups are receiving grants for ideas that are not necessarily commercializable, it's literally a waste of time. So if you want to address that.
So I can, Kory, do you want to start, I guess? I mean, I'm happy to talk about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that the Center for Scientific Review, they definitely try to recruit people with business backgrounds and with business expertise onto their review panels. And if you have business expertise and you want to sit on a review panel, you can sign up for it, and I'm sure they will be happy to recruit more people. The SBIR panels are not all business. Not everyone on the SBIR panels has business expertise, and not everybody has an academic background. There is a mix, but you are welcome to sign up.
I'd just like to second that, and I think there is a mix there, and I know that the Center for Scientific Review is always interested in good reviewers.
In SBIR Phase 1, can you have a university as the outsource? What are the advantages?
Yes, you can absolutely have a university be one of the, be a partner on an SBIR Phase 1. As to the advantages, I mean, it depends, I mean, if it makes sense for that project, and I think it's a project-specific question as to whether or not it makes sense to have a subaward to a university for your specific project. But it's certainly allowed, and the guideline is that you can outsource up to 33%. But that's, again, something, if you feel like you're going to exceed that amount, you should talk to your program officer. We may have different options available.
Can you have a Phase 1 Sttr, then apply for a Phase 2 SBIR?
Absolutely. This is actually a change that happened during the last reauthorization. It allows you to switch between the two programs, the SBIR and Sttr, and in fact, you can have a Phase 2 Sttr and switch and get a Phase 2B SBIR. So there is switching that's now allowed.
Next question is regarding...
Can I add one?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
If I add one piece to that? At some institutes, NCI being one of them, the Phase 2B, you are eligible for Phase 2B predicated on SBIR funding from any federal agency. So it doesn't, your Phase 2 doesn't need to have come from NIH. So if you're considering Phase 2B, and check with your program office, because you may be eligible and you don't even realize it.
Regarding application to different institutes, can the application contain same aims as long as only one award is accepted? For example, can you submit the same aims to NIAID and NINDS if aims are relevant to both centers, both institutes?
So you can only submit, you're submitting an application to the NIH. So you're going to submit one application, and it's going to be assigned a primary institute, and then it may be assigned a secondary institute. What you can't do is you can't submit two applications, one to, say, NINDS and one NIAID, say, the two different institutes. You can't submit the same application, to two different institutes, because that's considered a duplicative application. You can submit the same application to two different agencies, so say NSF and NIH, but the institute, you're going to submit one application, it's going to go to NIH, and it's going to be assigned to one institute, and then there may be secondary institutes on there, but usually it's you get one primary institute associated with your application.
Once a Phase 1 SBIR is pending administrative review, how quickly can I anticipate the project to start? How quickly will the funds be paid out? We have been pending administrative review for a few months, and the program officer can't help with an expected start date.
It depends. Okay.
I think, Stephanie, I think you cut out. It depends on the budget, I think, is where Stephanie was going. You may be back.
Am I back?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, it depends on a variety of factors. It depends on the budget. There are, sometimes there are flat-out time constraints where a program officer, I've had situations in my institute where we've had, a program officer, another program officer left, and so, we do have sometimes odd work constraints that can extend things. Sometimes there's an internal review process that particularly fast tracks have to go through because it is internally reviewed. So we are looking at the progress report and making sure that the phase 1 milestones have been met. So it can take some time. It depends a little bit on the institute. We'd ask for your patience. And just be aware that it might be either a specific circumstance or they may be reviewing it and trying to get some questions addressed as well. And then the other thing to make sure is that you don't have something pending specifically from grants management in your inbox. I think sometimes the grants management emails do go to spam, and so make sure, or even my email sometimes will go to people's spam boxes. And so we'll request something and we might not get a response. So just bear that in mind, that there could be a variety of factors. Your patience is appreciated, and I think we're all, working hard to make that as short as possible.
Okay, we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. Is it possible to interchange the principal investigator and co-principal investigator of our phase 1 submitted on January 5th because of the 50% employment requirement of the principal investigator?
So this is kind of a specific question. I'm going to talk generally a little bit about changing principal investigator. If you submit a request to change your principal investigator, that's a fairly serious request because when the application is reviewed, it's reviewed with one person, and we have to then determine if the application was reviewed with this new person, would it have received the same score, would it have been reviewed the same? And so I just keep in mind, I think people sometimes come to me, and I understand, look, at this point, I have seen everything, and I say that, and then something will happen tomorrow, but I've seen everything, and I think, obviously there are times when we do need to change the principal investigator, and I understand that, but bear in mind, it's not a given, and we do review each of those as specific individual instances.
I think we've got time for one more question, and hopefully we can fit it in the time left. I noticed the omnibus is sponsored by many agencies. How is the funding allocated to the omnibus split up among agencies? We submitted 2 applications to the omnibus, and they went to 2 different agencies, so we realized we had this question. How is funding prioritized?
Okay, so a couple of quick things to note. One, they're not different agencies, they're institutes. So it's how is it divided among the different institutes? That's actually a budgetary decision. So the SBIR allocation is determined by the overall budget of the institute, which is determined by the Office of Budget Management and Congress. So there's the overall budgets of each institute are set by the Office of the Director, Office of Budget, Congress. However, the SBIR allocation is the percentage of that budget for each institute. Now, you're going to submit to the omnibus, and then it goes through the process for that individual institute, and then that individual institute has an SBIR or Sttr budget. And so each individual institute kind of does run their own budget. And I'm going to slip this in there before we end. One of the big questions that we did get is around budget and how much money can you ask for a specific application. As Kory was saying, there's those guidelines, that 150 and 1 million. I can tell you for our institute, it is very common to go over that amount. I don't even bat an eyelash for people to go up to the cap. And then we do have some, waiver categories above that. So I think if you see 150 and think it's not worth my time, please don't think that that's the standard grant application. You can go above that. Many applications do. Please contact me, and I'm happy to talk about your budget and make sure that it fits.
I want to echo that for NCI. It's very common to go above those caps and go up to the waiver amounts. So just contact the program office, and we can talk to you about budget as well.
There are many more questions, which unfortunately we won't be able to get to today. And there are also some very positive comments about the value of this information. We are about to wrap up, but I just wanted to remind our audience that copies of the slides and a recording of the webinar will be made available in the next few days. And you'll be receiving an email with instructions on how to get access to them. So watch your email, check your spam mailbox as well. Stephanie and Kory, thank you again for your great presentation and for sharing your extensive knowledge and perspective of the SBIR Sttr program. In closing, on behalf of Women in Bio and ShareVault, I'd like to thank you and our audience for the time and the great questions, and I wish everyone a very good rest of the day. Thank you, everybody.